I thought my dad was a hero until the DNA test revealed he'd been living the biggest lie of his life. What I discovered didn't just destroy our relationship, it shattered everything I thought I knew about my own identity. Growing up, I worshipped my dad. I mean, what kid doesn't think their father hung the moon? But with my dad, it felt different. He wasn't just some regular suburban dad who worked 9 to 5 and coached Little League on weekends. My dad was special. His name was Robert. But everyone called him Bobby. He had this incredible backstory that made him seem like a character straight out of a movie. He'd tell me stories about his childhood in Ireland, how his family fled during the Troubles in Northern Ireland when he was just 12 years old. The way he described it, they barely escaped with their lives, leaving everything behind to start fresh in America. "We came here with nothing but the clothes on our backs," he'd say, his Irish accent still thick even after 30 years in Boston. "But America gave us a chance, and that's why you should never take anything for granted, sweetheart." I loved those stories. He described the rolling green hills of County Cork, the stone cottage where he grew up, his grandmother's soda bread recipe that was supposedly passed down through generations. Sometimes when it was just the two of us, he'd speak to me in what he claimed was Irish Gaelic, teaching me phrases that he said his own father had taught him. My mom, Linda, would just smile and shake her head when Dad got going with his stories. She'd met him when she was 22, working as a waitress at an Irish pub in Southie. Dad was 25, this charming immigrant with big dreams and an even bigger personality. He swept her off her feet with his accent and his romantic tales of the old country. "Your father could charm the birds from the trees," Mom would say, but there was always this fondness in her voice, like she was still that 22-year-old girl falling for the handsome Irishman. Dad worked construction, but he had this entrepreneurial spirit. He was always talking about the business he was going to start, the opportunities he saw that other people missed. He'd point to buildings around Boston and claim he'd worked on them, tell stories about the other Irish immigrants he'd helped get jobs, how they all looked out for each other. What made him even more special to me was how he treated our Irish heritage like this precious gift he was passing down. He celebrated every Irish holiday with elaborate decorations and traditional foods. St. Patrick's Day wasn't just a day to wear green. It was a full cultural celebration. Dad would make colcannon and shepherd's pie, put on traditional Irish music, and tell us stories about leprechauns and banshees that would give me nightmares for weeks. He subscribed to Irish magazines, hung a massive Irish flag in our living room, and even tried to teach me traditional Irish dancing. I was terrible at it, but he was so patient, so proud whenever I managed to get a few steps right. "This is who we are," he'd say, holding up old photographs that he claimed showed our family back in Ireland. "This is your legacy, Katie. Never forget where you come from." The photographs were my favorite part. Dad had this old shoebox filled with black and white pictures that he said were of our relatives back in Cork. There was one particular photo of a stern-looking man in a flat cap that Dad claimed was my great-grandfather, Seamus O'Sullivan. Another showed a woman in traditional Irish dress who was supposedly my great-great-grandmother. "She had your eyes," Dad would say, pointing to the woman in the photograph. "The O'Sullivan eyes. That's how I knew you were mine from the moment you were born." I treasured those stories, those connections to a place I'd never been, but felt like home in my heart. Dad promised that one day, when we had enough money saved up, we'd take a family trip to Ireland. We'd visit the old family farm, meet distant relatives, maybe even find the cottage where he grew up. As I got older, Dad's stories became even more elaborate. He'd tell me about his father, who supposedly died in a fishing accident when Dad was 15. His mother, who raised 5 children on her own, before passing away just before Dad immigrated to America. He painted this picture of noble suffering, of a family that had endured hardship but never lost their dignity or their love for each other. "The O'Sullivans are survivors," he'd say with pride. "We bend, but we never break." That became our family motto. When I struggled in school, when I got my heart broken by my first boyfriend, and I didn't make the soccer team, Dad would remind me that I was an O'Sullivan, that we were made of tougher stuff than most people. My younger brother Mike and I grew up believing we were part of something special, something bigger than just another working-class Boston family. We were Irish Americans with a rich history and a proud heritage. We had roots that went back centuries, stories that connected us to a homeland across the ocean. Dad made sure we knew we were loved, but he also made sure we knew we were different, special, connected to something ancient and meaningful. I carried that pride with me everywhere. In college, I majored in Irish studies. I wrote papers about Irish immigration to America, using my own family's story as a primary source. I felt like I had this authentic connection to the material that other students just couldn't match. Looking back now, I realize how completely I bought into Dad's narrative. It never occurred to me to question any of it. Why would I? He was my father. The stories felt real because he told them with such conviction, such emotion. When he talked about Ireland, his eyes would get misty. When he spoke about his parents, his voice would crack with grief. I trusted him completely. We all did. The first crack in my perfect image of Dad appeared when I was 28. About 6 months after I'd gotten married to my husband, James. We were at a family barbecue. One of those lazy Sunday afternoons where everyone's gathered in my parents' backyard, sharing stories and catching up. My cousin Sarah, who'd recently gotten really into genealogy, was showing everyone this family tree she'd been working on. She'd been using one of those ancestry websites, the kind where you can upload your DNA and trace your lineage back generations. She was so excited about all the connections she'd made. Distant relatives she'd found, old family secrets she'd uncovered. "Katie, you should totally do this," she said, shoving her laptop in front of me. "Look at all the cool stuff I found out about Mom's side of the family. We have relatives in Germany we never knew about." I was intrigued, but also a little smug. It's cool, but I already know my family history pretty well. Dad's told us everything about the Irish side. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because I tried to trace Uncle Bobby's line and couldn't find anything? It's like nothing. It's weird." Dad, who'd been flipping burgers at the grill, suddenly appeared behind us. His usual jovial demeanor seemed a little strained. "What's weird?" he asked, his Irish accent sounding thicker than usual, which I'd noticed happened when he was stressed. "Oh, I was just telling Katie how I couldn't find any O'Sullivan records that match up with your family story," Sarah said innocently. "I mean, I found tons of O'Sullivans from Cork, but none with the names or dates you've mentioned. Maybe the records got lost or something." Dad's face went through this strange progression of emotions, surprise, then irritation, then something that looked almost like panic before settling on forced amusement. "Well, you know how it is with Irish records," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "The English weren't exactly careful about keeping track of Irish families, especially poor ones like mine. Plus, there was a lot of name changing when people immigrated. Officials at Ellis Island couldn't be bothered to spell Irish names properly." It was a reasonable explanation, and Sarah seemed satisfied. But something in Dad's tone bothered me. There was a defensive edge I'd never heard before, and he seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the whole conversation. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I brought it up with James. "Do you think it's weird that Sarah couldn't find any trace of Dad's family?" I asked. James shrugged. "Not really. I mean, your dad's explanation makes sense. Record keeping was pretty spotty back then, especially for poor immigrants. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to Dad's stories, looking for details I might have missed or inconsistencies I'd never noticed. That's when I started realizing that Dad's stories never really changed, but they also never really expanded. He told the same anecdotes, used the same phrases, described the same scenes. It was almost like he had a script he stuck to. When I tried to ask follow-up questions or dig deeper into specific details, he'd either change the subject or give vague answers that didn't really satisfy my curiosity. I also started noticing things about his accent. Sometimes it would be thick and authentic sounding, but other times it would slip, especially when he was tired or distracted. I'd catch moments where he sounded completely American, with no trace of an Irish inflection at all. The real turning point came about 2 months later. I was helping Mom clean out the attic, when I came across a box I'd never seen before. It was tucked way back in a corner, covered with dust and old blankets. Inside were documents, birth certificates, social security cards, old driver's licenses, and they all belonged to my father. But the name on the earliest documents wasn't Robert O'Sullivan, it was Robert Sullivan. No, the birthplace listed wasn't County Cork, Ireland. It was Worcester, Massachusetts. My hands were shaking as I dug through the papers. It was a high school diploma from a school in Worcester. It's dated 1978. A birth certificate showing he was born at Worcester Memorial Hospital in 1963, a social security card issued when he was 16. None of it matched the story he'd been telling us our entire lives. I sat in that dusty attic for over an hour, staring at these documents, trying to make sense of what I was seeing.
Baby.
There was an explanation. Maybe Dad had needed to create a false identity for some reason I couldn't understand. But deep down, I already knew the truth. The man I'd idolized my entire life, the Irish immigrant, who'd overcome incredible hardship to build a life in America, the father who defilled my childhood with stories of our proud heritage and ancient roots, he was a fraud. When I finally confronted Mom about the documents, her reaction told me everything I needed to know. She didn't seem surprised. She looked guilty, like she'd been caught keeping a secret she'd never wanted to keep in the first place. "Katie, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been hoping this day would never come." "So you knew?" I asked, feeling betrayed all over again. "You knew Dad wasn't really Irish?" Mom nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I found out about 2 years after we got married. I confronted him about it then, but he begged me not to say anything. He said he'd created the Irish persona because he was ashamed of who he really was, that he wanted to be someone more interesting, more exotic. But why keep lying to us kids?" I demanded. "We had a right to know who we really are." "By the time you and Mike came along, the lie had become so much a part of our lives that your father was terrified to tell the truth," Mom explained. "He kept saying he'd come clean eventually, but there was never a right time. And honestly, Katie, you both loved the stories so much. You were so proud of being Irish. Your father couldn't bear to take that away from you. I felt like my entire world was crashing down around me. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, about my identity, it was all built on lies. The weeks following my discovery were some of the darkest of my life. I couldn't look at my father the same way. Every time he started one of his Irish stories, I felt physically sick. When he'd slip into his fake accent, I wanted to scream. The man I'd respected and adored for 28 years suddenly felt like a stranger. But what made it even worse was that he had no idea I knew. Dad continued with his usual routine, the Irish music on Sunday mornings, the stories about the old country, the plans for our someday trip to Ireland to visit our ancestral home. He'd look at me with such love and pride when he talked about our heritage. I'd have to excuse myself to keep from confronting him right there. James tried to be supportive, but I could tell he didn't fully understand why I was so devastated. "So your dad embellished some stories," he'd say. "Lots of people romanticize their family history. Doesn't change who you are." But that was exactly the problem. I didn't know who I was anymore. My entire sense of identity had been built on this foundation of Irish heritage. I'd chosen my college major based on it, wrote my senior thesis on Irish immigration patterns, even insisted on having Celtic symbols incorporated into my wedding decorations. I felt like a fraud, like I'd been living someone else's life. My relationship with Mom became strained too. Every time I looked at her, I wondered what else she was hiding. How could she have kept this secret for so long? How could she have watched me base so many life decisions on a lie and never said a word? "I know you're angry," she said one evening when I'd been particularly cold to her. "But try to understand. Your father wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He just wanted to be someone special." "But he was special," I snapped back. "He didn't need to make up some elaborate backstory. Why wasn't being himself enough?" Mom looked at me with such sadness. Because Robert Sullivan from Worcester, Massachusetts, wasn't someone he thought anyone could love. His father abandoned the family when Bobby was 10. His mother worked 3 jobs just to keep them fed. He grew up poor and ashamed, feeling like he was nobody from nowhere. Learning about Dad's real background should have made me more sympathetic, but it just made me angrier. I understood wanting to escape a difficult childhood, but creating an entire fictional identity, lying to your wife and children for decades, it felt unforgivable. The breaking point came during St. Patrick's Day. Dad had gone all out. As usual, green decorations everywhere, traditional Irish music playing, a feast of Irish foods that he'd spent all day preparing. He was in his element, telling stories and singing old Irish songs, in what I now knew was a completely fake accent. "This is what it's all about," he said, raising his beer in a toast. "Family, tradition, remembering where we come from." I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up abruptly, knocking over my chair. "Stop," I said. my voice shaking with emotion. Just stop with the fake Irish stuff. The room went silent. Dad's face went white, and I could see in his eyes that he knew his secret was out. But instead of confessing, instead of finally telling the truth, he doubled down. Katie, what are you talking about? I don't understand. I found the documents in the attic, Dad. I know you're not from Ireland. I know your real name is Robert Sullivan, not O'Sullivan, and you were born right here in Massachusetts. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom started crying softly. Mike, who'd been completely blindsided by this revelation, kept looking back and forth between Dad and me like he was watching a tennis match. Is it true? Mike asked quietly. Dad's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I thought he was going to confess everything. Instead, he got defensive. Those documents don't tell the whole story, he said. My family changed our name when we immigrated. The birth certificate is wrong. I was born on the ship coming over, but they didn't register it properly. There are explanations for everything. Even faced with irrefutable evidence, he was still lying. Still trying to maintain his fictional persona? That's when I realized that confronting him directly wasn't going to work. Dad had been living this lie for so long that he'd probably convinced himself it was true. That's when I decided to get a DNA test. I'd been thinking about it ever since Sarah mentioned genealogy testing at the family barbecue. If Dad was telling the truth about our Irish heritage, the DNA results would back him up. If he wasn't, I'd have scientific proof of his deception. I think you should do it, James said, when I told him my plan. It's not to hurt your dad, but so you can know the truth about your own background. You deserve to know where you really come from. Part of me was terrified of what I might find. What if we weren't Irish at all? What if our real heritage was something completely different? I'd built so much of my identity around being Irish American that I didn't know how I'd cope with discovering I was something else entirely. But I had to know. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I couldn't move forward with my life until I knew the truth about my past. I ordered the DNA kit online, a simple cheek swab test that promised to reveal my ethnic background and connect me with genetic relatives around the world. The kit arrived in a small white box that seemed too insignificant to contain the answers to such life-changing questions. Following the instructions, I swabbed the inside of my cheek and sealed the sample in the provided container. As I packaged it up to mail back to the lab, my hands were trembling. Are you sure you want to do this? James asked. Don't you know you can't unknow it? I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure of anything anymore. I can't keep living in limbo like this. The lab promised results in 6 to 8 weeks. Those turned out to be the longest weeks of my life. Every day, I'd check my email obsessively, looking for the notification that my results were ready. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, wondering what I was going to discover about myself and my family. I didn't tell Dad about the DNA test. I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. But I could feel him watching me carefully, sensing that something had changed between us. The easy relationship we'd always had was gone, replaced by this tension and mistrust that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. As the weeks passed, I found myself alternating between hope and dread. Maybe the test would prove Dad right, and I'd have to apologize for doubting him. Maybe it would reveal that we were Irish after all, just not in the way Dad had claimed. But deep down, I knew what the results were going to show. The only question was how devastating the truth was going to be. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 7:23 a.m. I was in my kitchen, still in my pajamas, drinking my first cup of coffee, when my phone buzzed with the notification. I'd been both anticipating and dreading for 8 weeks. Your DNA results are ready. My heart started pounding so hard, I could hear it in my ears. James had already left for work, so I was alone in the house. Maybe that was for the best. I wasn't sure how I was going to react to whatever I was about to learn. I sat down at my laptop with shaking hands and logged into the Ancestry website. There it was, my genetic profile, laid out in colorful charts and percentages that were about to either validate or completely destroy everything I'd believed about my identity. The ethnicity breakdown appeared first, a pie chart that made me feel like I'd been punched in the stomach. 45% English, 23% German, 18% Scandinavian, 8% Eastern European, 4% Scottish, 2% Irish, 2% Irish, 2%. I stared at the screen in disbelief, refreshing the page multiple times as if the results might change. But there it was, undeniable and scientific. After a lifetime of believing I was primarily Irish, of building my entire identity around my Celtic heritage, I was barely Irish at all. The largest portion of my DNA was English, the very people Dad had always claimed persecuted our Irish ancestors. The irony was so bitter I actually laughed out loud, though it came out sounding more like a sob. I scrolled down to see the detailed breakdown. The English ancestry showed strong connections to regions in Yorkshire and Lancashire. The German heritage traced back to areas around Bavaria and the Rhineland. The Scandinavian DNA suggested ancestors from Norway and Sweden. Even the small Scottish percentage was specifically Highland Scottish, not Irish Celtic. But it was the DNA matches that really drove the knife deeper. The website had connected me with potential relatives based on shared genetic markers. The closest matches weren't O'Sullivans from County Cork. They were Johnsons from Minnesota, Andersons from Wisconsin, Schmidts from Pennsylvania. One match in particular caught my attention. A woman named Linda Thompson, who showed up as a potential second cousin. Her profile included a family tree that went back several generations, all thoroughly documented with birth certificates, marriage records, and census data. Every single ancestor was accounted for, with no Irish heritage in sight. I clicked on her profile and sent her a message, introducing myself and asking if she knew how we might be connected. Within an hour, she'd responded with enthusiasm. "Katie, I've been hoping to connect with relatives from the Sullivan line. My great-grandmother was Elizabeth Sullivan from Worcester, Massachusetts. She had a brother named Thomas Sullivan who had a son named Robert. Could that be your father?" My blood went cold. Robert Sullivan from Worcester. It had to be my dad. Linda had included attachments, old family photos, census records, obituaries. There was a photograph from the 1940s showing a group of people at what looked like a family reunion. In the corner, barely visible, was a young boy who looked remarkably like my father. The census records told the real story of Dad's family. Thomas Sullivan, my grandfather, had indeed abandoned his family when Dad was young, just like Mom had told me. But there was nothing romantic or tragic about it. He'd simply walked out on his wife and 3 children and never looked back. My grandmother, Mary Sullivan, hadn't been some noble Irish matriarch passing down ancient traditions. She'd been a single mother working in a textile factory, struggling to make ends meet in a cold-water tenement in Worcester. The family had been poor, but they were thoroughly American, with roots that traced back to English settlers who'd arrived in Massachusetts in the 1600s. I spent hours going through Linda's family tree, tracing our shared ancestry back through generations of Sullivans, Johnsons, and Andersons. These were my real relatives, my actual heritage. Farmers from the Midwest, factory workers from New England, immigrants from England and Germany and Scandinavia who'd come to America seeking better lives. They weren't exotic or romantic. They weren't fleeing political persecution or carrying on ancient Celtic traditions. They were ordinary people who'd worked hard, raised their families, and built quiet, unremarkable lives. And somehow, that felt more authentic and meaningful than any of Dad's Irish fairy tales ever had. I called in sick to work that day. I couldn't imagine trying to concentrate on spreadsheets and conference calls when my entire world had just been turned upside down. Instead, I sat in my living room, staring at the DNA results and trying to process what this meant for my relationship with my father. He hadn't just lied about being from Ireland. He'd completely fabricated our entire family history. Every story, every tradition, every connection to our supposed Celtic heritage. It was all fiction. He'd stolen our real history and replaced it with fantasy. I thought about all the times I'd felt proud of being Irish American. All the papers I'd written about Irish immigration, all the Celtic jewelry I'd collected over the years. I thought about the Irish flag hanging in my parents' living room, the Irish music Dad played every Sunday, the step dancing lessons he'd insisted I take as a child. It was all based on a lie. But what hurt most was realizing that somewhere along the way, Dad had decided that our real family history wasn't good enough. That being descended from English farmers and German laborers and Scandinavian fishermen wasn't interesting enough. That he needed to create a more compelling narrative to feel worthy of love and respect. When James came home that evening, he found me still sitting on the couch, laptop open, surrounded by printed DNA charts and family trees. "How bad is it?" he asked gently. I couldn't even speak. I just turned the laptop screen toward him and let him read the results for himself. He was quiet for a long time, taking in all the information. Finally, he sat down next to me and pulled me into his arms. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I know how much your Irish heritage meant to you." That's when I finally broke down and cried. I cried for the identity I'd lost, for the father I'd never really known, for the authentic family history that had been hidden from me my entire life. I cried for all the Irish ancestors who didn't exist, and for all the real ancestors whose stories had been erased and forgotten. But somewhere in the middle of all that grief, I felt something else starting to emerge. Relief, maybe, or possibility. For the first time in months, I knew the truth about who I really was. I just had to figure out what to do about it. I waited 3 days before confronting Dad. 3 days of carrying the weight of scientific proof that everything he'd told us about our family was a lie. 3 days of rehearsing what I was going to say, imagining his reaction. Preparing myself for either a breakdown or more denial. I decided to do it at my parents' house, on familiar ground, where maybe he'd feel safer being honest. I told Mom I was coming over to talk to Dad about the family history situation. I could hear the resignation in her voice when she said, "Okay." When I arrived that Saturday afternoon, Dad was in the backyard working in his garden. He looked so normal, so peaceful, carefully tending to his tomatoes like he didn't have a care in the world. For a moment, I almost couldn't go through with it. This was still my father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework, and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. Did it really matter where his ancestors came from? But then I remembered all the years of lies, all the fake stories, all the ways he'd shaped my identity around fiction, and I knew I couldn't let it go. "Dad, we need to talk." I looked up from his plants, and I saw a flash of fear cross his face before he composed himself. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the DNA results. His face went through that same progression of emotions I'd seen at the barbecue months earlier. Surprise, panic, then forced calm. "I know the truth, Dad, about everything." "You're not from Ireland?" "We're not Irish. Your real family history is all documented. It has nothing to do with County Cork or the O'Sullivan clan, or any of the stories you've been telling us our entire lives." For a long moment, he just stared at the phone screen. Then he sat down heavily on his gardening stool, suddenly looking much older than his 59 years. "Katie, No more lies," I interrupted. "Please, I can't handle any more lies. I know about Thomas Sullivan, your real father. I know about your mother Mary, in the textile factory in Worcester. I've been in touch with your cousin Linda, and she's told me about our actual family history. So please, just tell me the truth." Dad was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and for the first time in years there wasn't a trace of an Irish accent. "I was so ashamed," he said. "When I met your mother, she was this beautiful, confident woman working at that Irish pub. All the customers loved her, and she seemed so... worldly, I guess. She knew about different cultures, different types of music and food. She made me feel boring." He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "I started with just a few little stories, you know. I'd mentioned having some Irish heritage play up the accent I'd picked up from hanging around the pub. She seemed impressed, so I kept going. But Dad, that was over 30 years ago. Why keep lying after you got married?" "After Mike and I were born." "Because I was in too deep," he said, his voice breaking. "Do you know what it's like to live a lie for so long that you start to believe it yourself? Sometimes I'd be telling one of those stories about Ireland, and I'd almost convince myself it was real. And you kids, God, Katie, you loved those stories so much. You were so proud to be Irish. How could I take that away from you?" I felt my anger starting to mix with something that might have been sympathy, but I couldn't let myself soften. "Not yet. Could have told us the truth about our real family," I said. "Thomas and Mary Sullivan might not have been as romantic as your Irish fairy tales, but they were our actual grandparents. We had a right to know about them." "What was I supposed to say?" Dad demanded, some of his defensiveness returning. "That your grandfather was a drunk who abandoned his family? That your grandmother died working herself to death in a factory? That I grew up so poor that sometimes we didn't have enough food? I wanted better stories for you kids." "Those weren't your stories to change?" I shouted, surprising both of us with my vehemence. "That was our history, our heritage, our family. You had no right to erase it and replace it with fiction." Dad started crying then, really crying, in a way I'd never seen him cry before. "I know," he sobbed. "I know I screwed up. I know I've hurt you and Mike and your mother. I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted to be someone worth knowing." "But you were worth knowing," I said, and despite my anger, I meant it. "You were a good father. You worked hard. You provided for us. You loved us." "Why wasn't that enough?" "Because I didn't think it was enough for your mother," he admitted. "And then later, I didn't think it was enough for you kids. I saw how proud you were of being Irish, how it gave you this sense of identity and belonging. I couldn't bear to take that away." We sat in silence for a while, both of us crying. Finally, Mom appeared in the doorway. She'd obviously been listening. "Are you going to tell Mike?" she asked quietly. I looked at both of them. My parents, who'd shaped my entire worldview with their deception, but who'd also loved me unconditionally and given me a happy childhood. "He deserves to know," I said. "But I think it should come from you, Dad. He should hear it from you." Dad nodded, wiping his eyes. "What happens now with us, I mean?" I honestly didn't know. I loved my father, but I didn't know if I could trust him anymore. I didn't know if our relationship could survive this level of betrayal. "I need time," I said. "I need to figure out who I am without all the Irish stuff. And I need to process what it means that my father has been lying to me my entire life." "I understand," Dad said, though I could see in his face that it was breaking his heart. As I drove home that evening, I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely liberated. The confrontation hadn't gone the way I'd imagined, but at least there were no more secrets between us. For the first time in months, my father and I both knew exactly where we stood. That confrontation happened 8 months ago, and I'm still figuring out how to rebuild my relationship with my father. It's been one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Learning how to love someone while also grappling with the fact that they've fundamentally deceived you about who you are. The first few months were the worst. Dad attempted suicide about 6 weeks after our confrontation. Mom found him in the garage with the car running, and if she'd been 20 minutes later, we might have lost him entirely. Spent 2 weeks in a psychiatric facility, and when he came home, he was a shell of his former self. "I destroyed everything," he kept saying. "I destroyed my family over stupid lies." That's when I realized that as hurt as I was, I didn't want to lose my father. Whatever else he'd done, he'd raised me with love and given me a sense of security and belonging. The Irish heritage might have been fake, but the love behind it was real. We started family therapy together, me, Dad, Mom, and Mike, who took the revelation about as well as I'd expected, which is to say not well at all. Mike was actually angrier than I was, if that's possible. He'd been planning to get an Irish family crest tattooed on his shoulder and felt completely humiliated when he learned the truth. Therapy helped us understand the psychology behind Dad's deception. Our counselor explained that people who grow up with trauma and poverty sometimes create alternate identities as a way of coping with shame and low self-worth. Dad's Irish persona wasn't just about impressing Mom or giving us interesting bedtime stories. It was about escaping from a childhood that made him feel worthless. Robert created the O'Sullivan identity because Robert Sullivan wasn't someone he felt he could love, our therapist explained. If he couldn't love himself, how could he believe anyone else would love him? Understanding the psychology made it easier to forgive Dad, but it didn't erase the damage. I had to completely reconstruct my sense of identity, figuring out who Katie Sullivan really was without the Celtic mythology that had shaped so much of my self-image. The DNA test had connected me with dozens of genetic relatives I never knew existed. I started reaching out to them, learning about my real family history. It turns out that while we weren't Irish, we had equally fascinating stories to discover. My English ancestors included a woman named Margaret Johnson, who'd been one of the first female telegraph operators in Massachusetts in the 1880s. My German great-great-grandfather had been a clockmaker, who'd immigrated to escape political upheaval in Bavaria. The Scandinavian side of the family included fishermen and farmers who'd settled in Minnesota during the harsh winters of the 1890s, building communities from nothing with the same determination Dad had always attributed to his fictional Irish relatives. These weren't the romantic stories of Celtic warriors and ancient traditions, but they were real. They were mine. And somehow, that made them more precious than any fairy tale Dad could have invented. Linda Thompson, my newfound cousin, became an unexpected gift in all of this chaos. She invited me to a family reunion in Minnesota last summer, where I met actual blood relatives for the first time in my life, knowing our true connection. It was surreal, seeing my own facial features reflected in strangers, hearing family stories that were documented and verifiable. Your father wasn't wrong about one thing, Linda told me as we looked through old photo albums together. The Sullivans really are survivors. Maybe not in the way he described, but look at what our family has been through. Abandonment, poverty, immigration, wars. We're still here. We're still strong. That helped me start seeing Dad's real story differently. Yes, he lied about Ireland. But the core message he'd always preached, that we came from strong people who'd overcome hardship, that was actually true. Thomas Sullivan might have abandoned his family, but Mary Sullivan had raised 3 children alone during the Great Depression. My ancestors might not have fled political persecution in Ireland, but they'd left everything behind in England, Germany, and Norway to build better lives in America. The hardest part was learning to separate my father's love from his deception. Dad had loved me enough to create an entire mythology around our family. But he'd also loved me so little that he didn't think the real me deserved the real story. It was a contradiction that took months of therapy to untangle. Slowly, very slowly, we started rebuilding our relationship. Dad threw away all the Irish decorations, stopped playing Celtic music, even took down the Irish flag that had hung in their living room for 20 years. At first I appreciated the gesture, but after a while, it felt like he was erasing himself entirely. You don't have to completely disappear, I told him during one of our therapy sessions. I'm not asking you to erase 30 years of your life. I just need you to be honest about who you really are. That's when Dad started telling us real stories about his childhood. Not the romanticized Irish tales, but actual memories of growing up poor in Worcester. Some of them were painful, the shame of wearing clothes from charity drives, the embarrassment of having his electricity shut off the day his father left and never came back. But some were beautiful. The way his mother would sing to him when he was scared, the neighbor who taught him how to fix cars, the teacher who believed in him when no one else did. These stories were harder to hear than the Irish fairy tales, but they felt authentic in a way Dad's fiction never had. They explained so much about who he'd become, his work ethic, his determination to provide for his family, his desperate need to be someone other than the abandoned little boy from the tenements. Mike and I started sharing our own stories too, how the fake Irish heritage had shaped our identities, the ways we'd have to reconstruct our sense of self, the anger and grief we felt about being lied to. It wasn't easy, but it was honest in a way our family had never been before. James was incredibly patient through all of this. He'd married Katie O'Sullivan, the proud Irish-American girl who could step, dance, and make perfect soda bread. Now he was living with Katie Sullivan, who was still figuring out who that person was. Some days I felt like a completely different person. Some days I mourned the loss of my Irish identity like I was grieving a death. You're still you, he'd remind me when I got overwhelmed. Your DNA doesn't change the fact that you're kind, intelligent, funny, and strong. The best parts of you have nothing to do with where your great-grandparents were born. About 4 months ago, something shifted. I was going through old photos, and I found one of Dad teaching me to ride a bike when I was 6. In the picture, he's running alongside me, his face filled with pure joy and pride. His accent might have been fake, and his stories might have been fiction, but the love on his face, that was completely real. That's when I realized that while Dad had lied about our heritage, he'd never lied about loving us. Every story he told, every tradition he created, every moment of pride when he talked about the O'Sullivan legacy, it all came from a genuine desire to give us something special, something to be proud of. He'd gone about it completely wrong, and the deception had caused tremendous damage, but the motivation behind it was love. Misguided, complicated, deeply flawed love, but love nonetheless. We celebrated Thanksgiving together for the first time since the confrontation. Instead of the elaborate Irish feast Dad used to prepare, Mom made traditional American dishes: turkey, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole. It was simpler, less exotic, but it felt more honest. During the meal, Dad raised his glass for a toast. I tensed, expecting another emotional speech about family and heritage. "I want to thank all of you," he said, his voice shaky but sincere, "for giving me the chance to learn how to be Robert Sullivan instead of Bobby O'Sullivan. It's scarier being myself, but it feels better too. We're not completely healed yet. I still sometimes feel a stab of anger when I think about all the years of lies." Right. Mike is still working through his own issues with trust and identity. Mom is still processing her role in maintaining the deception for so long. But we're a family again, maybe more authentically than we've ever been. We're the Sullivans from Worcester, Massachusetts, descendants of factory workers and farmers, immigrants and survivors. We don't have ancient castles or Celtic legends, but we have each other, and we finally have the truth. Last week, I started taking German language classes. Not because I'm trying to replace my fake Irish identity with an equally romanticized German one, but because I want to understand that part of my real heritage. I'm also planning a trip to visit Linda and my Minnesota relatives next summer, to walk the land my Scandinavian ancestors farmed and hear more stories about the people I actually came from. Dad asked if he could come with me. I'd like to meet our real family too, he said. I think it's time I learned who Robert Sullivan really is. I told him yes. Because while I may never fully trust him the way I used to, I'm ready to love him for who he actually is rather than who he pretended to be. Now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see the O'Sullivan eyes that Dad used to claim I inherited from my Irish great-great-grandmother. I see my own eyes shaped by English and German and Scandinavian ancestors, whose stories are just as meaningful as any Celtic mythology. I see Katie Sullivan, and for the first time in my life, I know exactly who that is.